Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome or welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. 2022 is officially over, and so it's time to pick my favorite books of the year. This is a video that I always have a lot of fun putting together and sharing with you, so I hope that you enjoy watching it as much as I love making it. I read 49 books this year and have selected 8 favorites to chat about with you today. As always on my channel, these are simply books that I read in 2022 and not necessarily books that were published this year, though I do think 2 or 3 of them were actually new releases. And as always, I am not including books that I reread in 2022 on this list, although there were some pretty fantastic rereading experiences that I had this year. The books that I'm discussing here are also not ranked in any way and are in no particular order except for the last 2, which were my 2 favorites of the year. Usually, all of the books that I talk about in my favorites video like this are books that you've heard me talk about before. But this year, there are 2 books that I never actually discussed on my channel. I didn't post a May and June wrap-up for 2022, partially because I was preoccupied planning for Jane Austen July, and partially because I read 2 books during those months, which were so amazing that it took me a really long time to get my thoughts together and wrap my head around discussing them with you. So I'm excited to finally do that today. I encourage you to make yourself cozy, grab a cup of tea or a snack, and join me for the books. The first book I want to chat about is The Night Watch by Sarah Waters. This book follows a series of characters during the Blitz in London. The first part introduces us to characters in 1947, after the war has ended, and we see the aftermath of World War II and how it has affected the social landscape of London and our characters. And then we trace those characters back through time to 1944 and back again to 1941 to see how their lives got the way they were when we saw them first in 1947 and how they've changed throughout the course of the war. It's a bit of a strange narrative structure, the way the story is told in reverse, but also in many ways it's much more character-driven than plot-driven, and it's interesting to see that character development happen in reverse. This is the first Sarah Waters novel that I've read that does not take place in the Victorian era. And based on those books set in the Victorian period, I come to expect some more fast-paced, plot-driven books from her. But this one let the action of the plot come from the war, which I thought was really well done. There was a lot of wonderful historical detail about the Blitz and how the war affected the British home front in particular, which I really appreciated because it's an aspect of World War II that I haven't ever studied in detail and am not too familiar with. I also really ended up loving that as time moved backwards, I learned more about the characters and was able to piece together information from earlier sections. Most of all, though, this book is about how those characters all cope with the shared trauma of the war, and specifically with living under the constant threat of the Blitz. It was a phenomenal book, as all of them are on this list, and I'm hoping to read at least one more Sarah Waters in this coming year. The next book on this list is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is a brilliant book that stuck with me all year, even though I read it pretty early on in 2022. The next book on this list is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is a brilliant book that stuck with me all year, even though I read it pretty early on in 2022. It's about Dana, an African-American woman living in the late 1970s in LA, who is suddenly taken back through time to antebellum Maryland, where she saves a young white boy from drowning. Although she is inexplicably whisked home, she is brought back to the past again shortly, where she realizes that her task is to save the life of this same white man over and over and over again. She comes to discover that the man whose life she keeps saving is actually her ancestor, and during her time in the past, she also meets her African American ancestors and becomes really entangled in plantation life. The book looks at the social mechanisms that enabled slavery, the violence, the helplessness, and the loss of self-dignity that those who are born into captivity endure. Dana becomes a symbol of a present-day African American woman, both made stronger from her heritage, but also still bearing the wounds and scars of past wrongs. The best thing about this book, though, is that despite its complex themes, which lend themselves to fascinating discussions about history and African American identity, and how we're shaped by the values and norms of our environment, this book was surprisingly and incredibly readable. It was very engaging and didn't feel unapproachable or dense in the least. The next book I have is Godmersham Park by Jill Hornby. This is one I've discussed a lot and pretty recently on this channel. I read it in November and made a whole video all about it. It's a fantastic book for historical fiction fans and Jane Austen fans alike. It's historical fiction about the real-life figure of Anne Sharp and her relationship with the Austen family. Anne was governess to Jane Austen's niece, Fanny Knight, between 1804 and 1806, and during that time she formed a friendship with Jane that lasted the rest of Jane's life. Godmersham Park looks at the role of a governess and the limitations of social positions available to single women during the time period, as well as Anne's own struggles with chronic illness. Jill Hornby really respects Austen's legacy and works here, and fills the gaps of history in brilliant ways. What she does with history here is very similar to what she did in her other book, which is all about Jane Austen and Cassandra's relationship. That's called Miss Austen, and I really loved it as well. If you're interested in hearing a bit more about Godmersham Park, you can take a look at my full video, which I posted back in November. I'll link it below for you. The next book on this list is The Haunting Season. This is an absolutely amazing anthology of super spooky, gothic, wintry short stories, pretty much all set in the Victorian era, and written by some of the best current historical fiction authors. It's the perfect book to read on a dark, cold, wintry night, and I gifted it for the holidays this year to not one, but two different people who I thought would really enjoy it. The collection as a whole has this amazing, unsettling tone and is full of creepy, gothic gorgeousness. With the exception of one story which wasn't set in the Victorian era and which I didn't really care for, this collection plays on Victorian era fears and tropes. There are classic haunted houses, disappearances, a haunting exploration of single motherhood, and ghostly patriarchal tyrants. One of the stories explores the dangers of childbirth and postpartum depression, and how that relates to female hysteria and madness. Another story plays on Victorian photography and its relationship with ghosts and death, which connects with 19th century spirit photography and the practice of photographing the dead. The way these authors allow their stories to explore so many facets of Victorian society was brilliant, and in many cases the stories were in clear conversation with various pieces of Victorian literature. I got definite Dorian Gray vibes from one of the stories. I believe it was Laura Purcell's, and I feel like Bridget Collins's A Study in Black and White has to be a reference to Sherlock Holmes's A Study in Scarlet. There were so many of my favorite authors in this collection, but it also makes me want to try authors that I've heard of but haven't previously read, like Jess Kidd. If you are a lover of Victorian literature and the Gothic, you simply must read these stories. The next book on this list is The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by D. Shaw Philyaw. This is one of the best short story collections I have ever read. It contains 9 stories all about American Black womanhood and focuses on a series of women who are all navigating between the image of who they think they're supposed to be and their own vision of who they want to be. These women's own needs, passions, and desires are pitted against the specific brand of morality that their church and their mothers have laid out for them, as well as society's general expectations of them. Each of these stories is about characters making peace with those external expectations while creating space in their lives for their own versions of themselves. The stories explore themes of queer relationships, mother-daughter relationships, complicated friendships, infidelity and loss, and so much more. Looking back months and months since reading this collection, I think the one story that remains with me most was called Peach Cobbler. It has the most scrumptious descriptions of dessert that I've ever read, but it also weaves together religion, a complex mother-daughter relationship, a coming-of-age story, and female sexuality, all tied together with Peach Cobbler, which is heavily laden with symbolic meaning. It's a symbol of love, desire, and expectations. It's the proverbial forbidden fruit. It's historically tied with the American South, and its history is about being cobbled together by settlers who lacked ingredients for some more traditional puddings, which really reflects the way that the mother in this story uses the dessert to cobble together a good life for her daughter. There's just so much depth and meaning in this very short story. I mean, how could you not want to read a story that starts with this amazing line? "My mother's peach cobbler was so good, it made God himself cheat on his wife." All of the stories in this collection are intimate and powerful. They're raw and serious and sorrowful at times, but there's also a real humor and levity to the writing style that really appeal to me. And this is one of those rare collections where each story stood out to me and yet worked cohesively within the collection. I feel like that's really rare for a single author to truly achieve with a short story collection. But this is a brilliant example of how it can be done. Each story was amazing in its own right, and with each passing story, I loved the collection more and more as a whole. I simply cannot recommend this collection enough. The next book on this list is Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Taylor Jenkins Reid is quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. I read 3 of her books this year, including her newest release, Carrie Soto is Back, but Malibu Rising was my favorite of the 3 by far. I love how Taylor Jenkins Reid tackles the concept of fame and celebrity and the way it impacts people's lives, which I consider to be a rather unique and underexplored theme in literature. I also love how she creates her own little universe where characters in her various books have connections to each other without being part of a series per se. Carrie Soto, for example, crops up in Malibu Rising, and I've been told that the father in Malibu Rising, Mick Riva, is one of the husbands in the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I haven't read that book yet, but it'll probably be my next read by her. I also love how Taylor Jenkins Reid just has this way of writing relationships between characters like no one I've read before. This book was so wonderful, not because of the plot, but because of the way it was written and the way that Taylor Jenkins Reid wove the different elements of the narrative together. Malibu Rising takes place in Malibu in the 1980s and follows the 4 Riva siblings in the 24 hours leading up to their annual end of the summer party. Interspersed throughout the 80s narrative, we're taken back to the 1950s and get to see the history of the family, how the characters' parents, Mick Riva and June, met, and bits about the different characters' childhoods, how they grew up and became the people they are in the 1980s timeline. Taylor Jenkins Reid takes all of these little pieces and themes, such as fire and water, surfing, parenthood, fate and fame, and so much more, and weaves it into this beautifully executed piece of fiction. This book has such a wonderful, summery, beachy vibe to it. I highly recommend it for the summer months, or for the winter if you're looking for a bit of an escape from reality. The second to last book on this list, and therefore one of my favorites of the year, is The Half-Life of Valerie Kaye by Natasha Pulley. The Half-Life of Valerie Kaye is exactly the type of glorious, all-consuming historical fiction that I expect from one of my favorite living authors. It's historical fiction that reads almost as if it's a dystopian novel. The events and circumstances in this book are so harrowing and disturbing that they seem like something out of science fiction, and yet The entire book is simultaneously grounded in reality. The book is set in 1960s Russia and centers on Dr. Valery Kolkanov, a nuclear scientist who has been surviving in the Gulag. Recommended by his old mentor, Valery is removed from the Gulag and given the opportunity to be a scientist once again. He's expected to serve out his prison term in the mysterious City 40, studying radiation on local animals. But his research raises far more questions than it answers. Why and how is this area so irradiated? And what crucial safety information is being hidden from the townspeople? It's questions like these that could get Valery killed before finishing his prison term, but the scientist in him can't help but satisfy his curiosity. Only Natasha Pulley has the ability to write something that explores such terrifying, dark, raw themes in such a wry and light manner. She strikes the perfect tonal balance to keep me engaged but not overwhelmed by the dark subject matter. She also has a unique talent for writing nuanced, complicated characters who are pushed to their moral limits by the course of history. Valery and KGB officer Shankov are both fascinating looks at how humanity tries to do its best within limited circumstances. These characters may commit horrific actions, crimes even, but the measures they take do not necessarily make them corrupt or evil beings, nor do they make us as readers dislike them at all. The themes of morality, justice, and individualism are handled exquisitely in this novel, and Valery and Shankov add to the conversation around morality that Pulley has previously started in her other works, with characters like Missouri Kite from The Kingdoms. The half-life of Valery K is a bit of a departure for Natasha Pulley, both in time period and in the lack of supernatural or magical elements. Pulley proves, however, that she can bring her quintessential lightness and humor to serious subjects and make even the darkest aspects of the human experience seem magical. I've recommended this book to everyone who will listen, and I can't wait to see where Natasha Pulley's writing takes her next. My other favorite book of the year is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This book was a true masterpiece and work of art. It left me feeling really reflective and contemplative and rather stunned. It was a very hard-hitting and emotional book for me, and it has such an interesting and complex narrative structure. Sea of Tranquility spans many different time periods and genres. It starts out as historical fiction in 1912 with the character of Edwin St. Andrew crossing the Atlantic by steamship to find his purpose in life. He enters the beautiful forests of the Canadian wilderness when suddenly he hears the notes of a violin echoing in an airship terminal, an experience that he can't possibly understand or make sense of. The book continues briefly as contemporary fiction in 2020, exploring characters from St. John Mandel's previous book, The Glass Hotel. And then it propels us into the future to 2203, where a famous author is conducting a book tour for her best-selling pandemic novel when a real-life pandemic breaks out. Strangely enough, her novel contains a passage where a man plays the violin for spare change in an airship terminal as the trees of a forest rise around him. And then we are further propelled into 2401 with moon colonies and elements of sci-fi and speculative fiction. And then back again through the timelines to unravel the connections between the various characters and make sense of the phenomenon that binds them together. There are so many beautiful complexities in the structure and formatting of this book, and it shouldn't work, but somehow it just does in the weirdest and most wonderful way imaginable. Emily St. John Mandel's writing is so precise and clean and beautiful, and the whole book also sort of functions as her personal response to the pandemic and to her previous writing. She works all of these really interesting autobiographical ruminations of herself as an author and her experiences having written the famous pandemic novel of Station 11 and then living through the pandemic herself. It's reflective, but also playful autofiction, and I love it in a Kurt Vonnegut-esque way. It's truly one of the best responses to the pandemic I've ever experienced, and it really touched me deeply. Sea of Tranquility has so many things that I typically dislike in a book. It's got too many characters and timelines, sci-fi themes, it takes place in the future, and yet it's my favorite book of the year because yet again, Emily St. John Mandel's writing and her ability to connect disparate characters across space and time is utterly brilliant. I feel like the last line of this book captures the spirit of the book and my experience in reading it perfectly. And don't worry, the last line isn't going to spoil anything. I absolutely would not do that to you. It reads, I've been thinking a great deal about time and motion lately, about being a still point in the ceaseless rush. And that's exactly how I felt both reading the book and during the pandemic. And somehow I still kind of feel that way. Like so much is happening in the past and the future, and everything is moving so quickly and so slowly at the same time. And I'm just a still point in this rush that I can't catch up with. So, anyway, those were my thoughts on The Sea of Tranquility. It really is a brilliant book, and I don't think that I've quite done it justice here. I also don't know if it's a book for everyone, but it was the right book for me at the right time. And the beauty of Emily St. John Mandel's writing and the emotional whirlwind of an experience that I had while reading it propels it to probably my favorite book of the year. I do think it beats Natasha Pulley's book, The Half-Life of Valerie Kay. I will say that Emily St. John Mandel is a brilliant author, but if you've never read her work before, this is definitely not the place to start. I would say that Station 11 is probably a good place to start with her work, probably the best place, and that you should read The Glass Hotel before reading Sea of Tranquility as well. So those were my favorite books of 2022. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on them. What were your favorite books of the year? Do you have any overlap with me, or are yours completely different? If you've read these books, I'd love to know what you thought of them, if you love them as much as I did, or if you have some controversial and conflicting opinions to me. I'd love to hear all your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, I will see you in another bookish video very soon. Bye.